Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was in the second week of June, 1892, if memory serves, that I was roused from an early supper by the sharp rapping of Holmes's cane upon the front door of my modest Kensington rooms. I had seen little of my old friend since his return from a lengthy engagement in the north of Yorkshire, and his telegram that morning had merely read, "Urgent and sensitive matter. Prepare for travel. Yours, S.H." He stepped inside with the same lean and hawkish air I remembered well, his grey eyes bright with the unmistakable glint of a case. The summer heat had left most Londoners languid, but Holmes's energy cut through the air like a whip. "Pack a valise, Watson," he said briskly, brushing past me toward the parlour. "We are bound for Bedfordshire on the morning train. There's a mystery nestled within the parish of St. Luke's, and it has the local vicar quite beside himself." I was already donning my boots. "A murder?" "No," Holmes replied, his tone maddeningly neutral. "A disappearance. A most inconvenient one. For the groom, the family, and the wedding guests. A bride has vanished, Watson. Vanished in her wedding gown minutes before the ceremony, leaving behind neither note nor trace." I blinked. "An elopement," Holmes raised a finger. "An elopement is a matter of passion. This case is devoid of such warmth. Let me brief you." Once settled by the hearth, Holmes drew from his coat pocket a letter, its creamy stock bearing the faded crest of a countryside manor. "It arrived 2 days ago," he said, "from a Colonel Harrington, retired military man, stiff as a ramrod and utterly mortified by scandal. His daughter, Miss Emily Harrington, was set to be married last Saturday to a Mr. Edwin Pritchard. The guests had gathered, the bells were due to ring, and the church was dressed in lilies and lace. Yet when the hour arrived, Miss Harrington was nowhere to be found. No carriage tracks, I asked, no witnesses?" "None. According to the household, she was seen in her dressing room a half-hour prior, speaking with her maid. 10 minutes later, the maid returned with her veil and found the room empty. Window open, no footprints in the garden below. The grounds were searched, the nearby brook was dredged, and the police from Bedford summoned." "And their findings?" Holmes gave a mirthless smile. "Bedford's finest declared it a nervous flight. The girl, they suppose, suffered a fit of doubt and made off into the woods. And yet, Watson, would a young lady abandon her entire family, a reputable match, and a gathered congregation of over 200, without so much as her cloak?" "Not if she were of sound mind," I replied. "Which I take it Miss Harrington is?" Holmes nodded. "By all accounts, intelligent, graceful, and loyal. There is no lover, no debt, no whisper of scandal. Colonel Harrington insists she had no cause to flee." I stirred my tea. "But then what are we to assume? Kidnapping, foul play?" Holmes leaned forward. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must determine. What makes this case rather compelling is not merely the disappearance, but the extraordinary absence of motive. The girl had wealth, comfort, and admiration, none of the usual cracks that give way to such calamities." He paused, steepling. For his fingers, "I suspect, Watson, that Miss Emily Harrington did not walk out of that room alone. I suspect she was removed." I straightened in my chair. "By whom?" "That, too, we shall discover. The Colonel has asked for discretion. We must be there by midday. The church, the house, the village, all lie waiting, and somewhere among them, I am convinced, is a quiet lie waiting to be disturbed." By the following morning, Holmes and I were aboard the 8:10 to Bedford, the countryside a blur beyond our compartment window. He sat cross-legged in thought, eyes half closed, while I pored over the brief notes he'd jotted in his pocketbook. Name: Emily Harrington, age 23. Status: only daughter of Colonel Jonathan Harrington. Fiancé: Mr. Edwin Pritchard. Solicitor: 31 London event. Wedding scheduled for June 10th at St. Luke's Parish. Disappearance between 11:20 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. From her dressing room in Harrington Hall. As the whistle blew for Bedford Junction, Holmes finally stirred. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "do not concern yourself with the obvious questions. Our task is to look where the others have not. If a young woman vanishes from a locked house in broad daylight with no one seeing her leave, then we must ask what else in that house is not what it seems. We descended from the train into warm, fragrant air, and a platform nearly deserted, but for a tall, stiff man with a military mustache scanning the crowd. He caught sight of us and strode forward. "Mr. Holmes," he barked with restrained urgency. "Colonel Jonathan Harrington, thank God you've come." Holmes inclined his head. "Colonel, this is my associate, Dr. Watson." "Gentlemen," the colonel said, "my daughter is gone, my house is under scrutiny, and unless we can solve this damned riddle quickly, I fear the press will soon do it for us." Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Then let us begin where all—" "Brides do, Colonel, with the dressing room." And with that we climbed into the waiting carriage, unaware that beneath the gentle green of Bedfordshire's summer fields, a secret lay coiled, waiting to be unknotted by the finest mind in London. The road from the Bedford station to Harrington Hall wound gently through fields that blushed with summer bloom. Yet there was no warmth in the colonel's expression as he sat rigid opposite us in the carriage. Holmes observed him silently for several minutes, letting the noise of the wheels and hooves mask his thoughts. Then at last, Holmes spoke, his voice a soft thread through the morning air. "Tell me, Colonel, about the moments leading up to your daughter's disappearance. Spare no detail, however trivial it may seem." The colonel's jaw twitched. "Very well. It was a sunny morning, if you can believe it. The air was as calm as glass. Emily had been calm herself, cheerful even. My sister, her aunt, Mrs. Dalrymple, was helping with her dress. The maid, Nora, was in and out fetching things. At 11 sharp I went to my study to receive the vicar. I was gone perhaps 15 minutes. When I returned to the parlour, the house was in disarray. Nora was sobbing, my sister was shouting for the servants, and Emily, gone. Just gone." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Was the door to her dressing room locked?" "No. It was ajar." "And the window?" "Open, as if to invite suspicion of flight, though there were no prints in the garden, nothing to suggest she leapt or was taken." "Was anything missing? Clothes, personal items, money?" "Nothing but the girl herself." He looked down, his voice rough. "And the veil? The maid swears she left it on the side table. When she returned, it was gone." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "An interesting detail. And the fiancé, Mr. Pritchard, what of him?" The colonel's moustache twitched. "Distraught. He's remained nearby at the village inn. I cannot fault his devotion, but nor can I fully absolve him in my mind. Something, I don't know. Something about this whole affair rings false." Holmes nodded slowly, then turned his eyes to the window as the trees thinned and the grey chimneys of Harrington Hall rose above the hedges. The house itself was of Tudor bone, angular, ivy-laced, proud in its age and quiet symmetry. Yet there was an unease about it, as though the very walls mourned. A footman met us at the carriage steps, and we were ushered into a grand, wood-panelled foyer where the air carried the faint scent of old roses and older varnish. A woman in widow's black emerged from the sitting-room to greet us. "This is my sister, Mrs. Dalrymple," the colonel said curtly. "She's been staying with us for the past month." Holmes extended a hand, his manner courteous. "Madam, may I ask when you last saw your niece?" Mrs. Dalrymple, a woman of sharp bone and sharper eye, nodded tightly. "I left her at 11:30. She was serene, glowing even. Nora and I had just finished the final pinning of her train. I kissed her cheek and went to check on the flowers at the altar. When I returned 10 minutes later, the girl was gone." "As though plucked out of the very air." Holmes tilted his head. "Was the room in disarray? Any sign of struggle?" "No. Her bouquet remained. Her slippers were beside the hearth, but no veil, and no Emily." He said nothing, but his glance at me was significant. We followed the colonel and Mrs. Dalrymple up a wide staircase, through an oak corridor softened by carpets, until we reached the dressing room. It was a handsome chamber, high-ceilinged, with a four-poster bed, a carved walnut dressing table, and a large casement window flung wide over a hedged rose garden. Sunlight filtered in, illuminating dust motes and casting a warm glow over the parquet floor. Holmes moved silently across the room, hands behind his back, eyes flicking from object to object with surgical precision. He paused beside the dressing table, where a silver-backed hairbrush sat beside a bottle of lavender water and a delicate ivory fan, then to the side table near the window. A porcelain vase of fresh lilies, a small Bible, a lace handkerchief, and nothing more. Nothing has been moved. Holmes asked. Not since she vanished, the colonel affirmed. We've kept it exactly as it was. Holmes knelt and examined the floor near the window. He pressed a hand to the windowsill, then leaned out to inspect the drop below. 15 feet down to a bed of loam and grass. No signs of scuffing or broken foliage, he murmured. If she climbed out, she did so like a ghost. He then turned his attention to the closet, opening the doors and peering within. Rows of neatly hung dresses, shoes arranged by color. Holmes's long fingers reached for the back wall and rapped. Lightly, solid, he muttered. No false panel, I spoke, breaking a long silence. Holmes, is it not possible she was lured? A note, perhaps, a message delivered? Holmes didn't answer. He was crouched now, his eyes level with the skirting board beneath the bed. He reached forward, then paused. Colonel, he said without rising, was your daughter in the habit of writing letters in this room? The colonel looked surprised. Yes, certainly. She often corresponded with cousins in Yorkshire. Then where is her stationery box? We all turned to look. The writing desk bore a lamp, a blotter, a pen, and inkwell, but no paper, no envelopes, no box. Mrs. Dalrymple stepped forward, her brow furrowing. How strange. It was always here. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. The removal of such a personal item suggests intention. Either she took it to write a note, or someone else removed it to ensure we never saw one. He turned to the window once more. Watson, fetch me your walking stick. Puzzled, I handed it to him, and he extended it toward the rose trellis outside the window, testing its strength. The wood creaked faintly, not sturdy enough to bear a woman's full weight, he concluded, but perhaps just enough to guide a veil downward. The colonel stiffened. Are you suggesting someone removed it from the window? Lowered. It like a signal. Holmes smiled faintly. I suggest nothing yet, but we must visit the church next. There is always something to be learned at the altar. Within the hour we were walking up the village lane toward the parish of St. Luke's, a modest stone building, nestled behind a moss-covered wall. The vicar, a red-cheeked man in spectacles, met us at the gate with profuse apologies. I've never seen such confusion, Mr. Holmes. The poor girl vanished like smoke. We searched the pews, the vestry, the bell tower. I don't suppose, Holmes interrupted gently, that you have a copy of the wedding register from that morning. Of course. The vicar produced it from a folder. Holmes flipped through the pages until he reached the June 10th entry. Emily Harrington's name was written in a precise, elegant hand beside Mr. Edwin Pritchard's. Holmes stared at it for a long time. Curious, he murmured. She signed it in advance. The vicar frowned. Yes, she asked to do so on Friday just in case nerves made her hands tremble on the day. Holmes nodded, then pointed. And this, beneath her name. Do you recognize it? A faint scrawl. In pale ink, nearly invisible. 2 initials, N.H. No, the vicar admitted. I never noticed it before. Holmes closed the book and handed it back. Then let us pay a visit to Mr. Pritchard. I believe the man who was to be husband may know far more than he has yet revealed. He turned, his coat sweeping behind him like a shadow. I followed, my mind racing. The bride was gone, the veil missing, the stationery vanished, and now cryptic initials left behind on a sacred page. Holmes had not yet shared his theory, but I could feel it building behind his eyes like a storm waiting to break. And still the question haunted me. Why would a bride vanish on her wedding day without a trace? And why had she taken the veil, but not the bouquet? The village inn, named the Dog and Crown, sat modestly at the edge of the green, its weathered sign creaking in the early afternoon breeze. A wisteria vine clung stubbornly to the gables, and a border of lavender softened the stone path that led to the front door. Holmes and I stepped into the cool shadow of the entrance, where a boy of about 14 behind the counter quickly vanished to summon Mr. Edwin Pritchard. Holmes stood in the center of the common room, studying the portraits, above the hearth as though they might whisper a secret, while I took stock of the surroundings. The inn was neat and unpretentious, with beams of dark oak and the scent of coal smoke still lingering from the morning's fire. Footsteps on the staircase turned our attention to the man descending. Pritchard was of medium build, trim and sharply, dressed for the countryside. His collar was stiff, his cravat knotted perfectly, but it was the pallor of his face and the stiffness in his stride that betrayed the strain he was under. He extended a hand without confidence. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Watson, I trust the Colonel has explained my predicament." Holmes did not shake the offered hand. He simply regarded the man with the kind of calm scrutiny that made even the most innocent feel bare. "He has told me the facts as he knows them," Holmes said at last, "but I prefer to hear matters for myself. May we sit?" Pritchard gestured to a side parlour, and we followed him into a room with floral drapes and a writing desk near the window. A sheaf of correspondence lay open beside an untouched cup of tea. He sat heavily in a wing-back chair, clasping his hands together. "I hardly know what to say," he began. "One moment I was preparing to walk down the aisle with the woman I adored, and the next I was standing alone before 100 guests wondering if I'd been made a fool or lost her forever." Holmes leaned against the mantel. "Were there any signs in the days leading up to the wedding that Miss Harrington was hesitant?" Pritchard shook his head at once. "None." Emily was radiant, excited. She spoke often of our plans, our future in London. There was no cause for alarm, no quarrels, no secrets between us. "People often keep their secrets well," Holmes said dryly. "What of your relationship with the Colonel?" Pritchard hesitated. "Formal but cordial. He disapproved at first, thought I was beneath her. But I have respectable means. I studied law at Oxford. In time he warmed to me." Holmes glanced at the desk. "You've been writing letters?" Pritchard followed his gaze. "Only inquiries to the local police, and a letter to my uncle in Surrey. He's terribly fond of Emily and devastated by the news." Holmes picked up the topmost page and read a line aloud. "Still no word from her. I cannot believe she would do this to me without cause." He set it back down. "Do you believe she left of her own will?" "I don't know what to believe," Pritchard said, his voice rising. "If she had cold feet, why not say so? Why not run the day before? Why wait until the final moment, fully dressed, and disappear like some vanishing act?" "Did you see her that morning?" "Yes, briefly, around 10. I brought her a small box, an old family brooch. She seemed moved by it." "A brooch?" Pritchard nodded. "Emerald and gold, Edwardian. It belonged to my mother." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And where is this brooch now?" I don't know. I assumed she wore it. She did not. It was not found in her room. Either she never wore it, or someone took it after she vanished." The silence in the room thickened. Pritchard seemed genuinely startled by the suggestion. "Do you suspect theft?" "I suspect very little," Holmes said calmly. "But I note inconsistencies. A veil is missing, a brooch is missing, a stationery box is missing. All small objects easy to conceal, and perhaps easier to carry away when one is trying not to be seen." Pritchard's brow furrowed. "You think she took them, or someone else did?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "Were there any guests at the wedding whose presence was unexpected?" "Only my cousin, Ned Harford. He returned from India just last week. I hadn't expected him to arrive in time, but he sent a wire Friday evening." Holmes's expression flickered. "Harford, N.H." Pritchard blinked. "Yes, those are his initials." Holmes straightened. "Where is he now?" "He left the morning after. Said he had business in Liverpool." "Why?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because it seems, Mr. Pritchard, that your cousin left a small footprint behind in the wedding register. It's time we paid Ned Harford a visit." Outside, as we returned to the lane, I couldn't contain my growing unease. "You think this Harford had something to do with Emily's disappearance?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that Mr. Harford may be the first thread in a very careful knot. Why sign the register with his initials? Why leave so abruptly the next day? Why bring himself uninvited to a wedding where, it now seems, several small objects and one very large one, namely the bride, disappeared?" We returned to Harrington Hall and requested the Colonel's permission to view the guest list. Holmes pored over it with a strange intensity, his finger trailing down the names. Here, Ned Harford, guest of the groom. No address listed. Curious. Most guests have their residence noted. The colonel frowned. He arrived unannounced. Edwin vouched for him. Holmes tapped the page. And here, one name is struck out. Who is Miss Clara D? The colonel looked, then grunted. Clara Dalrymple, my sister's daughter. She declined at the last minute due to illness. Holmes glanced up. Did she often correspond with Emily? They were close. Wrote weekly, I believe. And was her letter of declination kept? Mrs. Dalrymple, who had just entered the room with a tray of tea, overheard and answered. I placed it in Emily's stationery box, she said, along with some other things she wanted to keep. Old letters, cards. Holmes arched an eyebrow. So it was there the night before? Yes. Without a doubt. Then its absence becomes all the more significant. The pieces were forming, albeit faintly. We had a visitor whose initials matched the strange mark in the register. A brooch given and then vanished, a veil gone, a box of personal letters removed. And now a cousin who declined to attend, but whose communication was among the missing objects. Holmes paced to the window. Watson, he said, do you recall what I said about looking where others have not? Yes, you said we must question what in the house is not what it seems. He turned, eyes glittering. Indeed, and now we must ask, what in this house has not been searched because it was presumed to be untouched? We must go back to the dressing room. There is a piece still missing, one more absence I had not accounted for. We followed him once more through the silent corridors. The room was just as we had left it. Holmes crossed to the closet and threw it open again. This wardrobe. It is deeper than it appears. The back panel is slightly bowed. He pressed his palm against it. There was a hollow knock. With sudden, precise movement, Holmes reached behind the lowest row of gowns and gave a sharp tug at a brass hook near the seam. The panel gave way with a soft click. Inside was a narrow compartment, no more than a foot wide. But within, carefully folded, was a long white veil, and beneath it, a brooch of emerald and gold. Holmes did not speak at first. He held the items in his hands as though weighing the story they told. Then he turned to me. Watson, she did not run away. She hid something here. She wanted it found, but only by the right person. I stared. Then where is she now? Holmes gave a slow, almost reluctant breath. That, I believe, depends on whether Ned Harford left alone, or whether someone else left with him, dressed in mourning black instead of bridal white. And with that, the storm behind Holmes's eyes began to break. Holmes did not linger once the hidden veil and brooch were recovered. He wrapped both carefully in his handkerchief and tucked them into his inner coat pocket. There was no triumph. In his manner, no glimmer of satisfaction. Only that sharpened silence I had come to recognize when his mind had moved from discovery to deduction and was already galloping toward the next turn in the path. Watson, he said, barely above. A whisper. We are chasing not merely a disappearance, but a plan, one precise enough to include misdirection and misbelief as part of its design. I glanced at the small alcove, now empty save a faint impression in the dust where the veil had rested. She hid the brooch. That speaks to intent, not panic. Indeed, and more than that, timing. She could not have concealed these items if she'd been taken by force. No, she had a moment of calm, possibly just minutes. That moment tells us everything. We were interrupted by the light knock of a servant announcing tea downstairs. Holmes waved him off with a curt thank you, then turned to me once we were alone again. She leaves the brooch and veil behind. Why those two things, Watson? Why not the slippers, the bouquet, or some token letter? The answer is in the contradiction. These are two things she ought to have taken if she was simply walking away from the altar, but instead she hid them. It's not merely a message, it's a denial of the narrative. You mean? She wanted someone to know she hadn't run away? Precisely. These items were meant to be discovered, but only once it was too late to follow. Then why not leave a note? I asked. Holmes's face darkened slightly. Because a note could be forged, or intercepted. A hidden veil and a missing brooch are facts. She chose her symbols carefully. And Ned Harford? I pressed. You suspect he helped her? Holmes looked thoughtful. Perhaps. But I find myself wondering if his departure was as voluntary as we assumed. Consider, Watson, if someone wished to leave a place undetected, wouldn't they do well to leave in the shadow of someone expected to travel? You think someone else may have left disguised as him? I think, Holmes replied, that Ned Harford's name is being used. Whether by himself or another, I cannot yet say. We returned to the Colonel's study, where the fire had been lit despite the warmth outside and the heavy curtains drawn. The Colonel looked up as we entered, his face weary. Well, more riddles or any answers? We've found the veil, Holmes said, removing the handkerchief bundle and laying it gently on the desk. And the missing brooch. The Colonel stood abruptly. Where? In a concealed compartment behind the wardrobe in your daughter's dressing room. The man paled. Then, she was there. She didn't run. No, Holmes said softly. But she also did not intend to be. Found quickly. The Colonel ran a trembling hand through his silver hair. Who could have helped her do such a thing? Possibly someone already familiar to the household, Holmes said. Someone who could move within the wedding crowd unnoticed. Tell me, Colonel, did your niece Clara Dalrymple truly fall ill on the morning of the ceremony? Mrs. Dalrymple, who had entered behind us and caught the tail of the question, spoke quickly. She wired us that she had taken fever and could not travel from Tunbridge Wells. Do you still have the telegram? Holmes asked. No, Emily must have disposed of it. I never thought to keep it. Holmes gave the faintest of nods. It would be most helpful if you could wire her now. Request she confirm the nature of her illness and when precisely it began. Yes, of course, said Mrs. Dalrymple, puzzled. But what are you implying? I imply nothing, madam. I prefer questions to implications, for now. An hour later, we found ourselves once again aboard a train, this time not north but west, toward Liverpool. Holmes had managed to trace the hotel where Ned Harford had allegedly booked a room. A wire from the concierge confirmed that a man matching his description had indeed arrived, but had not returned after the evening of the 10th. The rhythm of the train soothed my nerves just enough for reflection. Holmes, forgive me, but I'm struggling to see the arc of this. If Emily wished to escape the wedding, she had ample chance to do so discreetly. Why all this theatre? Why vanish on the day in her gown? Because, Holmes said without opening his eyes, the impact mattered. Her absence needed to mean something, not merely to avoid a marriage, but to send a message to someone. To whom? Holmes opened his eyes then, and for a moment, they were almost sad. That, Watson, is what I fear we may uncover too late. Upon arrival in Liverpool, Holmes wasted no time. We went directly to the hotel listed in the registry. A young man at the front desk confirmed that Mr. Ned Harford had indeed stayed there for a single night. He had checked in under his own name, left no forwarding address and paid in cash. Did he leave alone? Holmes asked. The clerk hesitated. He arrived with a lady, sir, elderly, wearing a thick black veil. We assumed she was his aunt. She never left the room. Did you see her face? No, sir. Did they take the morning train? Actually, no, they left by hired carriage around dawn. The porter noted the time. Holmes's expression darkened. A hired carriage. That gives us little to trace. We stood once again in the Liverpool streets, the salt air from the docks clinging to the breeze, and Holmes's face set in iron lines. She was here, he murmured. He brought her here, or someone did. Veiled, anonymous, a ruse not to vanish in chaos, but to dissolve in silence. I followed his gaze down toward the distant masts of the ships. You think she's gone abroad? I think, Holmes said slowly, that she has made herself a passenger of someone else's story. The question is, did she do it willingly? We returned to the telegraph office, and Holmes composed 3 quick dispatches, one to Scotland Yard, another to a shipping agent he knew in Southampton, and the third, to my surprise, to the Colonel himself. Do you expect the Colonel to act? No, I expect him to react, and it is the reaction I'm most interested in. By the time we took rooms for the night, Holmes remained quiet, seated beside the window, his gaze fixed on the moonlit harbour. It wasn't until I had nearly dozed off that he spoke again. Watson, think back to the veil. What about it? It was hidden, but not well. A child could have found it. She wanted it discovered. Yes, but the timing of the discovery would matter. She couldn't know who would find it. So either she trusted someone implicitly to return to that room, or she assumed everyone would eventually. I sat upright. You think it was a message to someone specific? Holmes nodded. Or a warning? If she suspected danger, not just regret or unwanted marriage, then she would take pains to disappear without a trace that could lead her captor to her again. You suspect Pritchard? No, Holmes said after a moment, but I no longer trust his innocence to be absolute. I trust only the logic of her silence. Just then, a boy from the front desk knocked. A telegram had arrived from Mrs. Dalrymple. Holmes read it aloud. Clara claims no illness, never sent telegram, did not write to Emily since May. Perplexed and worried. Stop. He exhaled slowly. Then he smiled. Well, Watson, that rather unties the final knot. What does it mean? It means, Holmes said, standing, that someone forged that telegram to remove Clara from suspicion. But why? Unless she was present, in some form. I stared at him. You believe Clara Dalrymple was at the wedding? I believe someone posed as her. Perhaps to pass through the house unnoticed. Perhaps to guide Emily out. And if that's true, then the stage is set, and the curtain rises on the next act tomorrow morning, back in London. For if Emily Harrington still walks this country under another name, Watson, we must find her before someone else does. We return to London before noon the next day. The train carriage was quiet, save for the soft rustling of Holmes's notes and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. I had learned not to disturb him during these spells of silence when thought possessed him utterly. His eyes remained fixed on some distant point out the window, though I doubted he saw anything of the passing countryside. It was not until we were within sight of Paddington Station that he spoke. Watson, we must make 3 stops before dusk. First, the offices of the Great Eastern Shipping Company near the docks, then to a certain theatrical costumier off Drury Lane, and lastly, to a flower shop in Bloomsbury. I looked up in surprise. A flower shop? Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, for it is the small things, Watson, the everyday things that betray extraordinary plans, and this case, I believe, revolves around the quiet manipulation of the ordinary. We disembarked, hired a cab, and soon arrived at the narrow grey-fronted offices of the shipping company. Holmes presented his card with swift authority. Within minutes, we were led to a clerk who confirmed several outbound vessels had left Liverpool 2 days prior. 2 of them bound for Canada, 1 for Lisbon and another for Cape Town. Holmes leaned in. Did any of those ships log a Miss Clara Dalrymple among their passengers? The man frowned and pulled a logbook toward him, flipping through the closely written pages. No Clara Dalrymple, sir, he said after a moment. But, wait, here's a Miss Carlotta Denham, boarded the Calliope to Halifax, aged 23, accompanied by a gentleman listed as her uncle, Mr. Edward H. Merriweather. Holmes's face gave no reaction, but I saw the pulse at his temple twitch. I'd be most obliged if you could show me their signatures. The clerk brought out a secondary book, and Holmes studied the flourished names. Well, he said softly, we've found our veil again, Watson. The penmanship matches the wedding register. She's still writing in disguise. As we stepped back out into the bustle of dock traffic, I fell in beside Holmes, troubled. She's gone to Canada, then? Or someone wants us to believe she has, Holmes replied. But consider this. Miss Harrington had every opportunity to flee openly. The shipping record was filed with correct documentation and signatures. That suggests forethought. But no one matching that name was ever announced among the guests or family. Why invent an alias so easily checked? Unless she wanted it to be checked. A breadcrumb, Watson. So where do we follow it? Back to London stage. The costumier on Drury Lane received Holmes with polite surprise, and even something like deference, an old acquaintance, it seemed, from a prior case. The shop smelled of camphor and dusted velvets, and racks of clothing lined the narrow aisle like soldiers awaiting inspection. Holmes showed the man a folded sketch, a rough but recognizable likeness of Emily Harrington's face, drawn from memory and lightly shaded. Has this young woman visited your establishment within the past 2 weeks? The costumier squinted, then nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Last Tuesday. She came with another lady, older, with a slight stoop and a black veil. They kept to themselves, asked about morning dresses and old-fashioned bonnets. The younger woman purchased a simple black frock and a brown travel cloak. Paid in cash. Did she give a name? No, sir, but she had a Yorkshire accent, though I suspect it wasn't real. Holmes's eyes gleamed. How so? Too broad. Performed, almost. Like a girl playing charwoman for a parlour joke. Outside, Holmes paused in the sunlight and exhaled. The pattern holds. She is laying false trails deliberately, disguises, misdirection. And now, Watson, to Bloomsbury. The flower shop was a narrow affair squeezed between a bookseller and a tailor's. Its windows were filled with wilting carnations and cheerful sunflowers. A woman in an apron dusted petals off the counter as we entered. Holmes's tone was affable but firm. "You delivered lilies and white roses to Harrington Hall last Friday for a wedding, did you not?" The florist nodded. "Yes, sir." "Large. Order. 4 dozen lilies, 3 of white roses, and a cascade bouquet. I'd like to know if any other orders were made by the same client in the days prior." She tapped her ledger and flipped back several pages. "Yes, there was one. A single nosegay of violets delivered to the same address. Tuesday morning." "Violets," Holmes repeated. "To the same name?" "No, sir. That order came from Miss Violet Clay. Unfamiliar handwriting, paid in advance." He turned to me once we were outside again. "The simplest things. Flowers, names, signatures. She is weaving a net of false identity, Watson, but it is a net of her own choosing. She is not fleeing danger. She is moving towards something. The question now is, what lies at the center of her maze?" Back at Baker Street, Holmes retired to his armchair without a word. I poured the tea and waited as the room darkened, the lamps catching the dust in the air like motes of golden mist. He sat unmoving, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he spoke. "Let us review. A bride disappears moments before her wedding. No note, no trail. A brooch and veil are hidden. Her supposed cousin vanishes the next morning. A false telegram is sent in her actual cousin's name. A ship logs her as a veiled woman under a pseudonym, but the trail is almost too neat. And all the while she leaves crumbs, a forged accent, a bouquet under a false name. Why? Because she wants someone to follow her, I offered. Perhaps, but I now think she wants only one person to follow her. Not the police, not her father, not even her fiancé. Then who? Holmes didn't answer at once. He reached into his coat and withdrew the veil, unfolding it delicately on the table. He ran his fingers along the edge, then paused, drew out a magnifying lens, and examined. "The hem, ha!" He leaned closer. "What is it?" I asked, crossing the room. Holmes turned the veil so I could see, a small embroidered initial nearly invisible. C, not E for Emily. C for Clara. "So she did pose as her cousin?" Holmes nodded. "But more than that, she sewed the signature into the veil she left behind. She wants someone to realize she's not who she appears to be, but she also wants to be that person. Think of what we've learned, Watson. She left her identity behind not simply to disappear, but to change shape." I stood back, struck by a sudden clarity. "You believe she assumed Clara's identity fully?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that she staged her own disappearance in order to escape something far deeper than a wedding. Perhaps something we've not yet glimpsed." He stood then and paced the room. "Tomorrow we visit the offices of Edwin Pritchard." "His law offices?" "Yes. Something about him continues to trouble me. Too clean, too composed. What if the marriage wasn't the trap she escaped, but the result of a prior one? You think he knew?" "I think," Holmes murmured, "that Miss Emily Harrington may have found something in his past, and instead of confronting it, she chose to vanish from it." He returned to his chair. "I suspect the truth lies not in what she did, but in what she read." "What she read?" Holmes's smile was faint and knowing. "Remember the missing stationery box. It held her letters. If she took it with her, then she's protecting correspondence. And that, Watson, means someone is afraid of what's inside." A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson stepped in with a telegram. Holmes read it, then handed it silently to me. "Miss Violet Clay, cited purchasing train ticket to York. Accompanied." By elderly woman departed 4:05 p.m. Inspector Greg Sony looked up. She's still in England. Holmes reached for his coat. Then the game resumes in York. We are late, but not too late. He paused at the door. This is no longer just a case of disappearance, Watson. It is a case of rebirth. By dawn the next morning, we were aboard the express to York, the city still asleep beneath a pearl-grey sky. Holmes had said little since receiving the telegram, though his eyes, clear, sharp, and unreadable, never once strayed from the countryside unfurling beyond the glass. His fingers rested on the arm of his seat, motionless save for a small, habitual flexing, like a concert. Pianist playing a silent refrain. I waited until the train had passed Grantham before speaking. Holmes, if we do find her in York, what then? Do we confront her? Return her to her father? Inform Mr. Pritchard? No, he said quietly. We do none of those things. I blinked. Then why are we pursuing her? He turned to face me, the light catching the contours of his expression. Because she's in flight, Watson, not from shame, but from entanglement. And if I'm correct, the final danger has not yet passed her. She has gone to ground in the only way she knows, by becoming someone else. We must find her, not to interrupt her. I escape, but to understand it. We arrived in York just after 8. The city bustled gently with morning life, vendors arranging their stalls in the shambles, carts rattling over the cobblestones, and cathedral bells beginning their slow, noble peal. Holmes, moving at once with purpose, led us directly to the station master's office. A few minutes later, we were inspecting the registry of recent departures and arrivals. There, Holmes pointed. Miss Violet Clay arrived yesterday at 6:22 p.m. 2 tickets from King's Cross. Paid in cash, no trunk, just 2 carpet bags. The station master nodded. They hired a cab. Holman's Stables. I believe they gave an address near Bootham Crescent. Holmes turned to me. Come, Watson, we'll walk. It was a brisk 10-minute journey along the edge of the Minster Gardens, and though Holmes made no comment, I could sense his attention sweeping every alley, every shadowed doorway, as if reading a set of footprints others could not see. We arrived at a modest boarding house of red brick facade, the curtains in the lower windows drawn, the brass nameplate dulled by age, Mrs. F. Granger, rooms let weekly. Holmes stepped inside, greeted the landlady with his customary courtesy, and presented his card. The woman, small and shrewd-eyed, gave a startled look at the name. Sherlock Holmes? Well now, I suppose this is about my new lodger. Holmes inclined his head. Miss Violet Clay? Yes. Her and her aunt. Took the upstairs front room. Quiet as mice. Paid a week in advance, no fuss. Have they gone out this morning? Just the elder one said she was going to the grocer. The young lady's still in. Holmes passed her a coin. May I trouble you for a brief word with her? It's of a sensitive nature. The landlady, now intrigued, nodded. Of course, give me a moment. She disappeared upstairs, and we waited in the narrow hallway, the scent of coal soot mingling with polished banisters and freshly cut flowers on the sill. After a minute, we heard soft footsteps descending. She appeared without ceremony, cloaked in grey, her hair pinned simply. No veil, no disguise. The face was unmistakably Emily Harrington's, thinner, perhaps, paler, but calm and composed. Her eyes landed on Holmes, and she did not flinch. I thought it might be you, she said. Her voice was steady, even weary. You took longer than I expected. Holmes gave the faintest of bows. Miss Harrington, though I suppose that name no longer applies, I've come not to interfere, but to understand. She studied him for a moment, then turned to me with a small wry smile. And Dr. Watson, goodness, I suppose you've recorded every twist of this ridiculous story. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. I've done my best to keep up, Miss Clara, she supplied softly, for now at least. Holmes gestured toward the narrow parlour off the hall. Might we speak inside? She considered a moment, then nodded. Yes, but only for a few minutes. My train leaves at noon. The room was dim and modest. She sat by the window, hands folded, and Holmes stood before the fireplace as though delivering counsel in his own drawing-room. I remained beside the door, unsure whether I was witness, guardian, or confessor. I'll be direct, Holmes said. You vanished with great care, leaving false trails, false names, and calculated silences. And yet you left a message for someone, or perhaps anyone clever enough to find it. Why? She didn't answer at first. Her gaze drifted toward the window where the morning sun slanted through lace curtains. Because I needed a witness, she said at last. Not to my escape, but to why I escaped. Holmes tilted his head. Go on. I was never going to marry Edwin Pritchard, she said quietly. That part you've guessed already. But it wasn't cold feet. It wasn't even fear. It was knowledge. Knowledge I acquired too late. Holmes remained silent, his eyes fixed on her face. He wasn't what he appeared. Charming, respectable, generous, all of that. But last month, quite by chance, I found a letter in his coat pocket. A letter meant for someone else, a woman in Birmingham. The handwriting was intimate. It referenced debts, threats, forged documents. He meant to marry me for my dowry and use it to settle affairs far darker than the law would permit. I confronted him in the gentlest way I could, asked about the letter, about the woman. Her voice caught, but only slightly. He laughed, told me to forget it, called it a misunderstanding. But his eyes changed. I knew then I had glimpsed the real man behind the curtain. I wrote to his solicitor, asking about certain deeds. I received no reply. Then I visited a friend in London, an actress, a clever one. She helped me form the plan. To disappear, Holmes said. To become someone else, she corrected. Someone without property, without obligations, without a name. Any man could leverage. She glanced at me then. Do you understand, Dr. Watson? I did not run from a man. I ran from a cage with velvet walls. Holmes moved closer. And what now? Canada? A new life under violet clay? No, she said, smiling slightly. That was a decoy. I took a room on the passenger list, but another woman boarded in my place. I sent her with the cloak and the veil and a purse of sovereigns. She'll arrive in Halifax and disappear, into quiet obscurity. And you? I'll go to Scotland first, then perhaps the continent. I haven't yet decided. I'll teach, perhaps write. I only needed time to begin. There was a silence in the room that felt oddly reverent. Holmes said, You know, of course your father believes you dead or abducted, that Mr. Pritchard will feign grief and mount a campaign of noble mourning. Her jaw tightened. I mourn, nothing that lies behind me. Then, after a pause, she added more softly, But my father, I will write him, in time. Not now. Not while Edwin still circles like a hawk waiting for the wind to shift. Holmes gave the faintest nod. You've built your story well, he said. But one question remains. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Why leave the veil? Her expression turned faintly amused. Because every good illusion needs a final act. I wanted someone to understand I left with my eyes open, that I was not taken. Holmes stepped back satisfied. I opened my mouth to speak, but she rose, her movement graceful and certain. You've followed me far enough, gentlemen, she said. Let me walk the rest alone. Holmes bowed. If ever you require assistance, under any name, you know where I reside, she smiled. You see through everything, Mr. Holmes, but thank you for not tearing down every curtain. With that, she turned and ascended the stairs, her footsteps soft, unhurried, and sure. Holmes and I stepped into the brightness of the street once more, the sound of city life blooming around us. I turned to him. Will you inform the Colonel? Holmes shook his head. No, not until she allows it. She is not a fugitive, Watson. She is an author, rewriting herself, and as we turned back toward the station I felt strangely lighter. Not every case, I thought, ends in justice or law. Some end in silence, in quiet reinvention, and Holmes, who so often chased shadows, had this time helped one slip free. We returned to London under a sky of soft grey silk, the clouds moving with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the weather itself had softened in the wake of the storm we'd just traversed. Holmes sat silently for most of the journey, not in one of his darker fugue states, but in a reflective quiet, a stillness not of brooding, but of closure. There was, I sensed, a rare calm in him, the kind that came only when the truth, however complex, had been gently released rather than seized. As the train pulled into Paddington, he stirred and turned to me. She is safe, Watson. That at least we have achieved. Whether the world knows it or not is immaterial, I nodded. You don't believe she'll contact her family soon? Eventually. when she is no longer hunted, not by the law, nor by the past. Her father will hear from her, though not in the way he expects. I believe Miss Harrington, or Clara as she now calls herself, intends to live without the weight of obligation or inheritance. And I, for one, shall not be the hand that returns her to the cage. We reached Baker Street by midday. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a warm nod and the welcome aroma of fresh bread. Before I could remove my coat, a telegram lay waiting on the mantel. Holmes lifted it with one brow raised. He read it twice in silence. Then he passed it to me. To Sherlock Holmes. Stop. Pritchard found dead in flat. Poison suspected. No sign of forced entry. Police at a loss. Request immediate assistance. Gregson. Stop. I felt the breath catch in my chest. Dead? But when? Likely this morning, Holmes replied, already moving to fetch his coat again. Poison, no forced entry, and a man left behind in the centre of a vanishing act. We reached Pritchard's London flat, a handsome second-floor suite in Gray's Inn, by 1:30. The scene was already well under control. Constable Bradshaw stood guard at the entrance, while Inspector Gregson waited within, his moustache bristling with restrained anxiety. Holmes, Gregson said, ushering us inside at once. Thank the heavens, it's a damned mess. Pritchard was discovered not 2 hours ago by his housekeeper. She arrived late. He hadn't rung for breakfast. Found him at his writing desk, slumped forward. Teacup at his elbow, untouched toast. Holmes passed into the study without a word. The body remained where it had fallen, face forward, jaw slack, eyes open in a glassy stare. The skin had taken on a faint greyish hue around the mouth and throat. A single cup of tea sat on the desk. The surface beside it bore no signs of struggle, only order, stillness, and silence. Holmes crouched, sniffed the rim of the teacup, and examined the porcelain with his lens. No scent, he murmured. But the residue, chalky. Arsenic, suspect. Watson? I bent down beside him and examined the mouth. Yes. The characteristic tightening. And the lividity suggests he died between 7 and 9 this morning. Gregson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. No broken locks, no disturbance, no one seen entering or leaving. Holmes stood slowly. Then he knew his killer, or let them in freely. Gregson frowned. You don't think it was suicide? No, Holmes said flatly. A man bent on erasing his own past does not leave his accounts balanced, his records filed and his boots polished. This was the end of a plan, someone else's. He began pacing the room. Let's consider, Gregson. A woman disappears on her wedding day. Her fiancé shows minimal distress, maintains composure, and provides carefully selected details. And now, after she has evaded every eye and vanished into a constructed new life, he dies. Silently, neatly, conveniently. You think she did it? No, Holmes said, his voice softening. I think she arranged it, or rather arranged for the right pieces to fall where they might. He turned toward the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside lay papers, meticulously arranged. Client, letters, contracts, and a single bound folio marked private. Holmes flipped it open, scanned the pages, then stilled. He held up a sheet for us to see. It was a handwritten confession. Unfinished. To whom it may concern, I hereby confess that I forged the deed to the Sutton property, falsified the transfer, signatures, and used Miss Harrington's family name to secure credit from multiple lenders under false pretenses. I did not intend harm, but circumstances. The sentence broke off. He was going to confess, I said. No, Holmes replied. He was forced to confess, or rather led to believe he must. This is not remorse, Watson. It's calculation born of panic. He turned to Gregson. Did anyone visit this flat this morning? Only the housekeeper. Arrived at 9:30, no signs of intrusion. Servants, Holmes asked. None stay overnight. He dined alone last evening, had a bottle of claret. No visitors reported. Holmes examined the window locks. No. Signs here either. But notice this, the doorframe varnish, slightly nicked. Someone used a master key or picked the lock with great care. Not forcefully, but skillfully. Gregson frowned. Then we have a professional? Perhaps, Holmes said. or someone with a reason to be quiet, someone who knew where the poison would be, someone with a hand light enough to mix it with. Tea while the man reached for his pen. He turned again to the desk, opened the side drawer and withdrew a photograph. Emily Harrington, seated beside Pritchard, both smiling stiffly. "Watson," he said, "if Emily learned the truth about his fraud, and he suspected exposure, then this morning's death was not murder. It was containment? You think she sent someone? I think someone chose to act on her behalf. Perhaps someone she confided in, someone with motive." Gregson looked up. "Ned Harford?" Holmes's face did not change, but something in his eyes flickered. No, Harford never returned to London, but remember Clara's friend, the actress who helped construct the escape. An actress skilled in voices, disguises, poison bottles labelled as prop spirits. A woman no one would suspect in a morning dress and gloves. We stood in silence as the pieces slid into place. She eliminated the danger before he could retaliate. I said, "No," Holmes said. "She gave him a choice. I suspect he drank the poison himself, thinking it was harmless, perhaps under the impression it was a calming draught. The actress need only sit and wait. Perhaps she even handed him the cup." He sighed. "A gentler death than the law would allow, but calculated nonetheless." Gregson exhaled. "We'll search for the woman." Holmes shook his head. "You'll find nothing, no fingerprints, no name, no trace. Only a clean cup and a man who realized, too late, that someone had rewritten his final chapter." That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe and stood before the fire. She created a story for herself, Watson, and when the antagonist threatened to write her ending for her, someone else took up the pen. "You approve?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. "I admire the precision, the restraint. The veiled message in the veil, the false departure, the substitute passenger. It was a performance worthy of the stage." "And justice?" "Justice," Holmes murmured, "sometimes wears the face of quiet disappearance." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But let us not forget, this was never about vanishing. It was about choosing who you become when no one's watching." And with that, he turned to the window, the gaslight throwing his silhouette across the curtain like the last page of a novel, quietly closing itself in the dark. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor of our sitting room. Outside, the sounds of London carried on, the clatter of hooves, the distant call of a lamplighter, the low murmur of conversation from a nearby corner. But within the walls of 221B, there was only silence and the steady draw of Holmes's pipe as he stood lost in thought. I too sat in quiet reflection, the events of the last few days weighing heavier now that the pace had slowed. "She was never in danger," I said after some time, not as a question but as an observation. Holmes turned his head slightly, not removing his gaze from the window. "Not in the physical sense, no, but psychologically, emotionally, yes. There are forms of imprisonment that do not require locks or guards, Watson. Emily Harrington's prison was expectation. And the cost of her freedom?" I pressed gently. "Pritchard is dead. Her father left, wondering if she drowned in shame or fled in disgrace." Holmes turned from the window and resumed his chair. "And yet she lives, Watson, not as a fugitive but as an architect of her own survival. Had she gone through with that marriage, she would have lost herself, quietly, respectably, and forever. Instead, she chose risk, subterfuge, reinvention, and perhaps vengeance," I added, watching him. Holmes's brow lifted faintly. "Vengeance implies passion. I believe this was something colder, not cruelty, clarity. She identified the threat, measured it, and neutralized it." "You think she ordered Pritchard's death?" "No. I think she revealed enough to the right person, someone more capable of action, someone who loved her enough to silence a man before he could. Strike first." Holmes paused, then added, "Or perhaps the threat spoke for itself. Pritchard may have sensed what was coming and chose his method of departure. I considered this. So you don't intend to pursue it further?" "What would I pursue?" Holmes said softly. "No evidence, no witness, no trace. All we have is the whisper of a story, an elegant one with all its loose ends quietly tied." "And yet," I said, rising to refill my cup, You seem dissatisfied." He watched the flames for a long moment before replying. "Only in that I suspect we have not seen the last of Miss Harrington, or whatever name she chooses next." There was a knock at the door. Not Mrs. Hudson's usual gentle tap, but something firmer, more official. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Gregson entered, his face tired, his coat damp from the evening mist. He removed his hat, but did not sit. "We've concluded the Pritchard inquiry," he said without preamble. "The coroner has ruled it suicide. Arsenic in the tea administered voluntarily. The confession was enough to close the financial fraud investigation." "And the mysterious woman in mourning?" Holmes asked. Gregson exhaled. "Vanished. No name. No trace. No prints. Just a faint perfume on the doorknob and a single smudge on the handle of the teacup." Holmes gave a faint smile. "A masterful performance." Gregson shook his head. "You know as well as I do, Holmes, this wasn't theatre. It was method, deliberate. Someone orchestrated it all to protect that girl." "She needed protection," Holmes replied, "and someone believed she deserved it." Gregson lingered, his tone shifting slightly. "There's more. A letter was delivered to Scotland Yard this morning, addressed to me, no return address, postmarked York." He handed Holmes the folded paper. I leaned in as Holmes read it aloud. "Inspector, Gregson, I ask only this. Let sleeping ghosts lie. Edwin Pritchard is gone. The debts are no longer owed. The story is over. If justice was denied in your eyes, I ask you to consider whether the law could ever have granted it. There are some wrongs so subtle, so cloaked in the language of love and propriety, that they can only be undone in silence. Please, do not search further. I am not running, I am walking away." V.C. Gregson looked at Holmes. "She's asking us to close the book." Holmes folded the letter and handed it back. "Then close it, Gregson. She's earned the final chapter." The inspector nodded once, then turned and left as quietly as he'd arrived. The clock on the mantel chimed 7. Holmes did not speak for a while, nor did I. The lamps glowed warmly, casting their golden hues across the walls. At last, Holmes reached for his violin. He tuned it slowly, carefully, then began to play. Not one of his usual fevered adagios, but something softer. A single melancholic melody. It rose and fell like a breath, as though he were translating the unsaid into music. As the notes filled the room, I found myself thinking not of crime, or guilt, or even escape, but of a young woman stepping into the unknown, wrapped in grey, eyes clear, spine straight. A woman who had refused to be a possession, a transaction, a bride in lace. Emily Harrington, or Violet Clay, or Clara, or whatever name she bore now, had not disappeared. She had emerged. Holmes played on, eyes half closed, the bow gliding across, the strings. When the last note faded, he opened them and looked at me. "Watson," he said quietly, "sometimes our role is not to arrest the story, but to bear witness to its resolution. And if it unravels again," he smiled, "then we begin a new chapter." There was nothing more to say. Outside, the fog began to settle over Baker Street like a curtain drawing shut, and within, all was still, save the soft ticking of the clock and the lingering echo of a melody that neither condemned nor forgave, but simply understood. It was 3 days later when the past came quietly knocking once more. I had just returned to Baker Street from my morning rounds, the air crisp, with an early autumn chill when I found Holmes already deep in thought by the window, a letter held loosely in one hand. The room smelled faintly of burnt tobacco and lavender oil, an odd mixture that made me pause before speaking. "You've had news," I said. Holmes didn't look at me. He merely passed me the letter with a flick of his fingers. It was unsealed, unsigned and written in an unfamiliar hand, neat, slanted, deliberate. I read it aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you once told me that the veil I left behind was a message. You were correct, but it was also a signal to someone else entirely. There was a watcher at the church that morning, not a friend, not family. He had no name on the guest list, but his presence was unmistakable. A tall man with a limp and a cane of carved ivory. I saw him from the window just before I vanished. He watched the house for 3 days after. He followed Ned. He followed me. Now, he follows no one. I believe you should know that. Do not try to find me again, not because I am afraid, but because I am no longer hiding. V. I lowered the paper slowly, feeling the silence settle between us like dust on a shuttered room. Holmes rose, walking to the fireplace. She was being watched, before the wedding, during her disappearance, even after she fled. Then it wasn't. Just Pritchard, I said. There was someone else? He nodded. A third figure, unnamed, unaccounted for. We missed him entirely, Watson, and he knew we would. He stayed out of sight until the others made their move. You believe she's telling the truth? I believe her tone, Holmes replied. It carries no panic, no plea, just certainty. I moved to the desk and unfolded the wedding guest list once more, a page I hadn't glanced at since our early inquiries. Tall man, ivory cane, not on the list. Could it have been a private investigator, a creditor, a rival suitor? Holmes shook his head. No, none of those would wait. This man observed, watched her vanish, followed her, but took no action until the others were out of the way, and then he follows no one. I stiffened. You think she's implying he's dead? Or at least, disappeared. There was a long pause before Holmes spoke again. When Pritchard died, I believed the arc had closed, but now I see the final thread was still unspooling. Someone else had an interest in Emily's disappearance, an interest neither familial nor romantic. Someone who waited, perhaps even manipulated events from the periphery. I looked at the letter again. Why would she tell you? Because she wanted me to stop looking, he said, and because she knows I won't. There was a quiet certainty in his voice that unsettled me, not because I disagreed, but because I recognized the inevitability of it. Holmes would never leave a question half-answered, no matter how delicate the balance of silence someone had tried to preserve. By midday, he had retrieved the records from Scotland Yard, quietly, unofficially. Among the footnotes of the investigation into Pritchard's fraud was a passing mention of a witness, a man seen near Harrington Hall the day before the wedding, loitering on the lane. He had been dismissed at the time as a solicitor's clerk, awaiting a client. Tall, thin, pronounced limp, ivory-headed cane, Holmes read aloud. The detail we missed. Who was he? No identification, Holmes murmured. But the same man was seen outside the boarding house in York 2 days after Emily checked in. She was right, I said. He was following her. Holmes stepped back from the file. We assumed she vanished alone, but what if her escape created a vacuum? And this man stepped in, watching for an opportunity, waiting to collect something left behind, money, documents, blackmail material. Or her, I said. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, or her, but she outpaced him, hid well, hid intelligently. And when she realized she had a shadow, she chose to make the final move. You mean she... Holmes turned away. She left no detail in that letter confirming anything. But it wasn't merely a warning, it was a verdict. She doesn't run anymore, Watson. That line, he follows no one, isn't a boast. It's an epitaph. We stared at the letter again, now weighted with new implication. Later that afternoon, Holmes made one final visit to an old theatre off Fleet Street. There, in the dim light of a rehearsal room lined with dusty wigs and faded velvet curtains, he spoke quietly with the actress we had only known by role until then. She said little, but her expression told the rest. When Holmes asked whether Emily had ever returned to London since the morning of the wedding, she shook her head. When he asked whether anyone else, male, tall, with a limp, had ever made inquiries about her, she nodded once. And now? Holmes asked. She met his gaze with steady eyes. No one comes looking anymore. That evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street, and for the first time in many days he filed the case away, physically and mentally. The notes, the witness statements, the lists of names, all slid into a thin, unmarked envelope. He sealed it. In wax, no label, no title. I watched as he placed it in the top drawer of his desk, locking it with a turn of a small brass key. You're done? I asked. I am, he said simply. But the third man, he is gone. We sat in silence again, not heavy this time, but pensive. I broke it gently. Holmes, do you think she's safe now? His eyes moved to the window where dusk had settled over Baker Street like a veil of its own. "Yes," he said, "and more than that, she's free." There was nothing theatrical in his voice, no flourish, just truth. And in that moment I knew the case of the bride who never took her vows had finally ended, not with arrest, nor trial, nor dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, deliberate unraveling of threads, until the story no longer bound its characters, but let them slip silently into new lives. She had written her own ending, and Holmes, for once, had let her keep it. It was nearly a fortnight after Holmes locked away the file on the Harrington case that the matter returned, not with drama but with the faintest ripple, just enough to stir the dust of conclusion he had so carefully let settle. I was dining alone at Simpson's when a young woman approached my table. She was plainly dressed, her hat modest, her gloves worn at the fingertips. There was nothing about her to catch the eye, except her composure and the curious familiarity of her gaze. "Dr. Watson?" she asked softly. I rose instinctively. "Yes." She looked about the room as if measuring the risk, then lowered her voice. "I believe you knew someone once, a girl who disappeared wearing white, who now wears grey and walks without looking back." I stared. "You know her?" "She sends her thanks," the woman said, "and a warning." That single word made the air change around us. What sort of warning? The woman reached into her handbag and produced a small folded sheet of cream paper. She placed it in my hand, glanced over her shoulder, and disappeared before I could ask another question. I returned to Baker Street with the note tucked into my coat pocket, uneasy but composed. Holmes was in his armchair, the violin resting across his lap, though he was not playing it. The fire was low, casting flickers of amber against the floorboards. Without a word, I handed him the paper. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, very quietly, he read the contents aloud. "Mr. Holmes, a man you thought had vanished has reappeared. The one with the ivory cane is not dead. He merely fell out of sight. He is asking questions again, not about me, but about you. Whatever game he was playing, it was never about the girl. It was always about who would follow the wrong trail first. You were meant to find her. And to believe it was the end, it isn't. Be careful with what you left unfinished." V. Holmes read the note again, this time to himself, then leaned back slowly in the chair. "So," he murmured, "the ghost returns. You believe her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "I do." "But why now? Why resurface at all?" Holmes tapped the paper lightly. "Because this was never about the bride. It was about the net around her. Pritchard was the most visible knot, but not the only one. We assumed the ivory cane man was a blackmailer, a scavenger hoping to profit from chaos. But if V is correct, he was something else entirely. I felt my stomach tighten. What could he possibly want from you? Holmes's gaze narrowed slightly, not in alarm, but in assessment. "It is a rare thing, Watson, when one realizes he has been cast in someone else's narrative without ever knowing the script. You think someone used the Harrington affair to manipulate you? Not just me. All of us. Pritchard, Emily, even Gregson. The man with the cane, he never intervened. He watched, calculated, waited. His silence was not hesitation, it was design. I turned to pace near the fireplace. "What do we do now?" "We observe," Holmes said. "For now, we do nothing." I turned sharply. "Nothing?" He stood, unfolding himself like a statue returning to motion. When a spider returns to its web, it does so to check the damage, not to spin again immediately. If he is showing himself, it is because he believes something has shifted. That someone has made a move. You mean Emily? Or someone else? We are no longer dealing with a crime of passion or desperation. We are facing a longer game, one that may have begun before the bride ever vanished. He reached into the drawer where he had locked the case file and retrieved it silently. For a long while we said nothing as he reviewed each page, names, timelines, sightings, photographs, old telegrams. He handled it all with reverence, as though assembling the edges of a map he had only half understood before. Then he stopped. "This," he said. It was a receipt, an innocuous line from the hotel in York. 1 guest, 2 carpetbags, breakfast for 1. I dismissed it, Holmes murmured. because I assumed the second bag was hers, packed in London. But she travelled light. She told us that, which means... He trailed off and turned sharply to the window. She wasn't alone when she arrived in York. I moved beside him. But we saw no trace of a second person. Exactly. Which means they were never intended to be seen. He turned abruptly and rang for Mrs. Hudson. Please fetch my directory. I'll need the number for the Midland Hotel in York. 20 minutes later, we had the hotel manager himself on the wire. Holmes inquired casually at first, then with increasing precision. Yes, he said, June 14th, booked under Miss Violet Clay, 2 carpet bags, occupied the upper north room. Yes, and you're certain no other name was associated with the reservation? A pause, I see. A second key was issued. No, I don't require the name, thank you. He hung up slowly, then looked at me. Someone travelled with her, he said. Not the actress, not Ned, someone else. The man with the cane? Possibly, or someone connected to him. Either way, she trusted them or was forced to accept them. The air had changed again. What had seemed a finished tapestry had begun to unravel, not in the centre but at the edge, where frayed threads went unnoticed until they began to pull free of the weave. That night, Holmes did not sleep. He sat with the envelope open across his knees, piecing the entire affair together again, not as a finished case, but as the prologue to something wider. I kept vigil nearby, my journal unopened, the lamp burning low. She chose to vanish, I said eventually. But someone chose to watch, and now he's watching us. Holmes nodded without looking up. Because whoever he is, he believes the game is unfinished. And now, so do I. And so the quiet tale of the vanished bride, which had once seemed resolved in veils and silences, took on the shape of something deeper, something stranger. A puzzle nested inside another. A curtain that fell only to reveal another stage. Holmes leaned back as dawn began to push at the corners of the room, the fog outside beginning to lift. Watson, he said quietly, we were not wrong to close the case, but we were wrong to believe it would remain closed. And somewhere beyond London's waking streets, the man with the ivory cane, no longer just a shadow, waited to take his next step. It was nearly a month later, in the waning light of an October afternoon, when the final piece of the puzzle fell quietly into place, not with a thunderclap but with a gentle tap at the door. Holmes and I had spoken little of the Harrington affair since that final note. The man with the ivory cane had vanished as swiftly as he'd reappeared, leaving only silence behind. And Holmes, though not idle, had folded the matter into the corner of his mind, the way he did with enigmas that had not yet offered up their full pattern. But that day the knock came, soft, deliberate. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. Holmes took it and read the name without expression. Captain Elias Tournier, he said quietly. Do you know him? I asked. He did not answer directly. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. The man who entered was tall, silver-haired, and carried, himself with the tired grace of a soldier who had seen too much and grown used to carrying it. His eyes were pale and alert, the eyes of a man who watched not out of fear but habit. He walked with a limp, and in his left hand he carried a cane of ivory and jet. He removed his hat, nodded to Holmes, and then to me. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I won't take much of your time. I've come to offer a confession, not of crime, but of design. Holmes gestured to the chair across from him. Then let's begin with the part where you watched a young woman vanish from her home, tracked her across counties, and disappeared just as quietly. Tournier smiled faintly. You saw more than most, but not all. Holmes did not speak. He simply waited. Tournier sat, resting the cane across his lap. I was never after Miss Harrington, not directly. I was after the men circling her, Pritchard. Oh, yes, but also the brokers behind him. She was the bait, not the prize. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So your intelligence was, Tournier said. Naval office, quiet operations, fraud, forgery, foreign entanglements. I had reason to believe Pritchard's finances were being used to launder the debts of a much larger scheme, the kind that could shift shares in European trade if left unchecked. But to prove it, I needed to let him play his hand. And I needed to know if Emily Harrington was part of the deception or merely trapped in it. Holmes sat back, steepling his fingers. And so you watched. You waited. I had to. If I intervened too soon, he would disappear into another identity. He had half a dozen waiting. But the girl, she did something I didn't anticipate. She vanished first. And that disrupted your strategy. It did more than that. It set fire to the net I'd cast. Everyone scattered. And suddenly I had to decide, protect the girl or continue the pursuit. Holmes tilted his head. So you followed her. Tournier nodded. She was clever, changed names, left false trails. But more importantly, she knew she was being watched, and she made a choice. He looked up at us both. She turned and confronted me. In York, not with fear but calm, she said, "If you're here for the truth, I'll give it, but not to be used again, not to help you punish him, only to make sure it ends." There was a silence then, heavy with things not said. Holmes said, "You gave her the second key." Tournier gave a faint nod. "I stayed in the room next door. We made it look like she was traveling alone. I helped her board a decoy under another name. She needed to disappear, and I needed to make sure she wasn't swallowed by the very web I was trying to dismantle." "And Pritchard?" I asked. "Did you kill him?" "No," he said evenly. "That was her story to end, not mine. But I made sure the people who funded him saw it, and when they did, the money stopped flowing." Holmes gave a slow nod. "You used her disappearance to shutter a network." "And she used me," Tournier said, not unkindly, "to become free." There was nothing more theatrical in it. No villains dragged to trial, no gunshots in the dark. Only the knowledge that two threads, hers and his, had briefly intersected, each saving the other in their own way. Tournier rose, his cane clicking softly on the floor. "I came to thank you," he said. "You followed a trail meant to distract and still found the truth beneath it. That is rare." Holmes stood as well. "And you?" "I'm finished," Tournier said. "The others will disappear now. They always do when the light turns their way." He turned to go, then paused. "She's alive, you know. Not in the legal sense, not in any court's registry, but in her own way, more than ever before." And then he was gone. Holmes stood at the window a long while after. "You knew," I said eventually, "that someone else had been pulling strings." I suspected," Holmes replied. "But I let it lie because for once, Watson, the game was not ours to win." He turned from the window, a glimmer of something almost like peace in his face. "Do you remember what she wrote? 'I am not running. I am walking away.' She did not ask for justice. She chose resolution. And him? A soldier who traded weapons for shadows," Holmes murmured, "who did what he could while he could." There was nothing more to uncover. That night, as Holmes played the violin softly in the gloom, I realized that not every mystery is meant to be unraveled completely. Some are meant to be understood just enough to grant peace, not punishment. The case of the bride who never took her vows would never make the papers. No arrests, no trial, no formal ending. But in a quiet corner of the world, a woman who had once stood at the edge of obligation now walked freely beneath another name. And behind her, a man with an ivory cane faded back into mist, leaving only silence and the faintest mark of grace. And Holmes, with all his brilliance and detachment, had done something rare. He had let the curtain fall without pulling it back.